So we said we can use the in operator to do searching to determine if one string is contained in another one. But actually, there's some very powerful methods that will also do that for you and do other things. They're a bit more useful and a bit more specific than the in operator. So the methods include find, so it determines whether a string contains another string. That's very much like in. Or more useful, starts with, determines whether a given string starts with the, or a string starts with the given string, or ends with, and determines whether a string ends with the given string, or count, how many times a string contains a given string. So, for example, let's look at these examples. So the string is hello world. Can we find or in it? Well, that won't return -1. It will tell us that it does contain or because it's in world. Does it start with HE? Yes, it does start with HE. So again, that will start with HE. Let's see the output. Yes, does it end with world? No, it doesn't end with world because there's an exclamation mark at the end. And if we look at contain string count L or string count or, we can see that hello world has 3 L's and it has just 1 or. So if I show you that, it's got 3 L characters and it's got 1 or substring. Okay, so we can find bits of the string. We can determine whether it starts with or ends with a particular string. So they're really useful for dealing with finding bits of a string. And just as an aside, this isn't really to do with strings, but just as an aside, we can use the idea of chaining some of these methods to make the code really concise and to save having to write temporary variables. And what I mean by chaining is using one method after another sometimes. So, for example, I can take a string, I can strip the white space at the beginning, I can then turn it into title case, and then I can justify it with some more centered in 30 width. Okay, so I didn't say that very well. So that allows me to use a whole bunch of methods that will modify a string and produce an output that I can then maybe print out in this case without having to create temporary variables or actually modify the original string. It'll essentially create a temporary variable that gets passed from one method to another, which is then I can then use at the end. This isn't, as I said, this is an aside. It's nothing particularly to do with strings because you can use all built-in methods like this to be chained in together, and we'll see more about that when we look at object-oriented programming next term. So let's have a look at some specific examples of string chaining though. So suppose we want to see if a user's response starts with yes, ignoring any trailing or leading white space. So the user might type in yes space, or they might type in space yes or something. We want to make sure that we ignore those spaces, and we want to do it case insensitively. So we really want to lower the response that the user gives us to lowercase and then check it against whether it's yes lowercase. So if you don't use chaining, you need something like response.strip to take off the white space at either end and then lower it and then see if it starts with yes. Okay. And the trouble with that, as well as being 3 lines of code to check whether the user said something that starts with a yes, it also modifies the response string. So if you want to use it again to know exactly what the user typed in, you've lost it. You'd have to save it somewhere else. With chaining, you can all do it as part of the if statement. So if response.strip.lower starts with yes, then we can deal with that string. So this chaining can be very useful to avoid creating temporary variables and to make the code quite concise and still quite readable. Conciseness isn't always readable, but I think in that case if you know what strip and lower and starts with do, then you can see that's quite easy to read. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here and then we'll get on and looking at processing strings.